It happened in the quietest way. A slip of paper falling from the spine of an old book she'd once underlined in the margins, now softened by time and tucked away on a forgotten shelf. The envelope landed face up, her name written in a hand that hadn't touched her skin in over 10 years, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the rhythm of her heartbeat. She didn't open it. Not yet. Because even now, long after she'd been the one to walk away, the ache hadn't gone. She had left while still loving him, thinking it was the braver choice. But she had never stopped wondering if he'd looked at her just once, not with goodbye, but with a plea to stay. Would she have? And in that moment, holding that letter like it still carried warmth, she whispered what she never dared say out loud. I was waiting for you to stop me. Have you ever been the one who left and still waited to be stopped? Ellen Hartley lived on the edge of Cedar Hollow, in a weathered one-story cottage with ivy curling up the windowsills and a porch that creaked just enough to sound like memory. The town was the kind that stayed the same even when people didn't, where shopkeepers still knew your coffee order from 15 years ago, and autumn arrived like an old friend, brushing red across the maple leaves without ever asking permission. Ellen had lived there since her divorce, drawn back to the stillness after years of trying to be someone louder, braver, more certain than she really was. She worked part-time in the town's second-hand bookstore, where she alphabetized forgotten authors and occasionally slipped handwritten poems between the pages of novels no one borrowed. There was a quiet to Ellen that people often mistook for peace. But if you looked closer, on mornings when the wind rustled through the birch trees, or when she paused a little too long while pouring her tea, you might see it. The flicker of something unresolved, a name she never said out loud anymore. She didn't speak of Daniel Callan, not because the memory hurt too much, but because it had settled into a place too tender for casual telling. He had been the only person who ever made her feel fully seen, and she had been the one to walk away, softly, almost carefully, as if afraid that staying would undo her. She told herself she left out of self-preservation. But some nights, when the house got too quiet and the past too loud, she wondered if she had simply been afraid of being loved well. Every morning, she passed the lakeshore bench where they once sat with thermoses of coffee and talked about everything except how much they meant to each other. The bench was still there, the silence too. And though no one asked anymore, Ellen still carried the question she'd never answered. What if I had stayed? Have you ever lived in a town where the seasons changed, but one feeling never did? It started as many small awakenings do, not with a bang, but with a soft creak, a sigh of wood under footstep, and the gentle resistance of a lid that hadn't been lifted in years. Ellen wasn't planning to revisit the past that day. She had climbed into the attic simply because the morning was too quiet, and the autumn sun, streaming through gauzy windows, made everything feel suspended, like something important might finally be ready to be found. She had opened boxes before, old Christmas ornaments, her mother's recipe cards, even the faded dress she wore on the day Daniel took her to the orchard. But this box, wide, low, covered in a linen she didn't remember owning, sat beneath layers of time and indecision. She lifted it out and brushed away the dust in slow, circular motions, like handling something sacred. Inside, books, letters, museum pamphlets, a pressed rose, more beige now than red, and tucked between two dog-eared travel journals, a hardcover edition of The Secret Garden, one she'd bought on a whim at a sidewalk sale in Cambridge. She opened it out of habit, fingers brushing familiar lines, and that's when it fell. A pale blue envelope, folded once, neatly, her name scrawled. In that slanted handwriting she hadn't seen in over a decade. She didn't touch it at first. Just looked at it, heart stilled in her chest, like the attic itself was holding its breath. Daniel's handwriting had always carried a particular rhythm, deliberate, careful, as if he weighed every word before letting it go. Even this envelope, aged and slightly curled at the corners, bore the weight of restraint. She reached for it, slowly, almost reverently, and slid the single sheet from within. The paper was soft, creased in the middle, yellowed slightly, but the ink hadn't faded. The words came into focus as her eyes adjusted, but her heart had already recognized their cadence. He hadn't sent it. That much was clear. It wasn't a letter meant to convince or to heal. It was something quieter, gentler, a confession given space. He wrote of mornings she forgot to drink her tea, of the way she always straightened his collar before he left, the house, of the silence that grew between them, not as a wall, but as a wound neither dared to touch. And then, near the bottom, a line underlined just once, so faint it might have been an accident. "I would have stayed, Ellen, if you'd asked." Her breath caught in her throat, not in pain, but in recognition. She remembered that day, the one he must have written this. She remembered the sky, flat and gray, the scent of cinnamon from the cafe down the street, the feeling of his hand lingering in hers just a second too long before she let go. She had left thinking she was protecting something fragile inside her, not realizing she was abandoning something rare. She folded the letter with trembling fingers, held it against her chest, and closed her eyes. The attic was quiet again, except for the faint rustling of dry leaves brushing against the house. And inside her, something shifted. Not broken, not healed, but acknowledged. Later, downstairs, she placed the letter on the kitchen counter beside her mug, and for the first time in years opened her laptop, not to shop or to read, but to type. Not anything polished, just a blank page and a blinking cursor, waiting like she had all this time. But before she wrote a word, she lit a candle, turned on the radio, and let the old playlist play. The third track, Daniel's favorite, began. And when the familiar hum filled the room, she whispered to the emptiness around her, "I left before I ever gave you the chance to stay." It was not regret that filled the room. It was something more tender. Something like forgiveness, perhaps, or the beginning of it. The kind that doesn't demand answers, only presence. The kind that lets an old letter found on an ordinary morning feel like the first breath after holding one's lungs too tight for too long. She waited 2 days before going back to the lake. It wasn't out of hesitation exactly, more like reverence, the kind of careful delay that comes from knowing a place holds something too big to touch without preparation. The letter still sat, folded in her coat pocket, and she found herself reaching for it throughout the day, not to read it again, but just to feel its weight, to remind herself that it existed, that he had written it, that maybe some stories weren't as over as they seemed. Mirror Lake hadn't changed. That was the strangest part. It still curved softly along the eastern ridge of town, cradled by trees that turned gold earlier than everywhere else, and even now in early October, the surface was still, almost glass-like, catching the sky in perfect symmetry. She parked where she always used to, halfway down the gravel lot, and made the short walk to the bench, the one tucked beneath 2 sugar maples that shed leaves like slow-moving confetti. She hadn't sat there in 9 years. It was where they had their first almost fight over something ridiculous, his refusal to use coasters, her way of always correcting grammar out loud. It was where he told her he liked the way her eyes went darker when she was deep in thought. And once, only once, when the clouds were thick and the mist curled up from the lake like breath, he said she looked like she was always carrying rain inside her. Not sadness, he clarified quickly. Just the kind of weather you don't forget. She sat down slowly, letting her palms rest on the worn wood, and tilted her head back. The leaves above her rustled but didn't fall. The quiet was heavy, but not unfriendly. And then, footsteps. She didn't move at first. The steps weren't hurried, but familiar, measured. Someone walking the path like it was a habit, not an accident. She glanced sideways just in time to see a tall figure in a navy wool coat pass by the fork in the trail, face turned slightly, as if scanning the lake, as if looking for something, or someone. Her breath caught. There was no mistaking the way he walked. She stood slowly, cautiously, afraid that if she called out, the moment would break. But the man paused, turned his head, and it was him. Daniel. His hair was shorter, touched with gray now. He had a slight limp she didn't remember. But his face, kind, unreadable, familiar as breath, stopped her where she stood. Their eyes met, just briefly, and in that fragment of a second, time folded. All the silences, all the words left unsaid, all the years of not knowing, collapsed into the weight of one look. He didn't speak, neither did she. But the truth was there, woven into the stillness between them. He hadn't left. He had never left. Not to another city. Not to another life. He had been here, in Cedar Hollow, the whole time. She felt her knees go slightly weak. For years, she had built a story in her mind. That he had moved away, started over. Perhaps married. Perhaps forgotten. It was the only way she knew how to live with her decision. Not as a tragedy, but as something inevitable. But now, she had to face what hurt far more. The possibility that he had stayed, that he had been just 4 blocks away, while she mourned him in the quiet privacy of her own detachment. And worse, that he had known she was here too. He took a small step, forward, not bold, not tentative, just open, and then finally he said her name. Ellen. It wasn't heavy with anger or disappointment, just soft, like someone speaking in a language they hadn't used in a long time but never forgot how to pronounce. I didn't know if you'd remember this place, he said after a pause, gesturing slightly to the bench behind her. I never forgot, she said quietly. I just stopped letting myself come back. They stood like that for a while. 2 people on opposite ends of a love that had never really burned out, only been packed away, like a coat at the back of a closet. I found your letter, she said finally. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture softened. I never meant for it to find you. I wrote it for me. To say something I couldn't. She nodded. It said enough. There was another silence then, one that pulsed with everything they weren't ready to ask. But there was one thing Ellen had to say, something that had sat too long in the quiet of her chest. You didn't stop me, she said, voice low. I walked away, and you let me. But, her voice cracked slightly. You didn't stop me, but your eyes, they said everything. Right after. You didn't stop me, but your eyes, they said everything. He didn't answer right away, just looked down at the ground where the leaves were collecting, around their shoes. I thought you needed space to figure things out, he said. And I was afraid that if I asked you to stay, it would make you feel trapped. I didn't want to be the reason you stayed for the wrong reasons. She blinked hard against tears that didn't come but wanted to. I told myself you left because you needed to, he continued. So I made peace with that. Or I tried to. She let out a quiet breath. And all this time, we were both just here, living parallel lives, pretending it hadn't meant more than it did. Daniel smiled then. Not a wide smile, but the kind you give when something finally makes sense. I didn't pretend, he said. But I also didn't know how to reopen something that ended without a door. She gave a small, rueful laugh. Maybe it never ended. Maybe we just closed the book too early, thinking it was safer than turning the next page. He nodded slowly, eyes still on hers. Would you like to turn it now? She didn't answer. Not yet. But she sat back down on the bench, and this time when he sat beside her, she didn't look away. The morning after seeing Daniel by the lake, Ellen woke to a house that felt unfamiliar in its silence. Not lonely, just suspended, as if the walls themselves were waiting for her to make the next move. The letter he had written, now resting, on the nightstand, seemed less like a ghost and more like a lighthouse, softly persistent, beckoning her not back, but inward. She dressed in layers, the way she always did in early autumn. Soft cotton, muted grays, a cardigan she hadn't worn. Since the year they parted, it smelled faintly of lavender and old books. She paused at the mirror in the hallway, noticing lines around her eyes that hadn't been there the last time she had looked too closely. There was no sadness in them, only time. It was a day for old places, and so she walked the 5 blocks. To Thistle and Oak Cafe, where the door still chimed its small, deliberate greeting, and the floorboards still whispered under her boots. She hadn't been here in years, not because it held pain, but because it held too much of what was once tender, and still unfinished. May stood behind the counter, wiping down the glass display like always. She looked up, did a small double. "Take," and then smiled. "Well," she said, setting down the cloth, "if it isn't Ellen Hartley. I thought you'd given up on cinnamon altogether." Ellen smiled back, but it came slowly. "Turns out I missed the smell of it more than I realized." May nodded as if that made perfect sense. She moved around the counter with the ease of someone who understood not only the rhythm of her cafe, but of the people who passed through it. "The window table's free." Ellen hesitated only a second before moving toward it. Their table. The one tucked into the corner where the light always poured through at just the right angle, warming the edge of your hand as you reached for your cup. She ran her fingers lightly over the grain of the wood, remembering afternoons filled with quiet laughter, shared articles, the brush of knees under the table. May brought over a cappuccino without asking for her order. "He used to sit here," she said, soft enough that it felt like an offering, not a provocation. "Every Thursday, same seat, 2 sugars." Ellen looked up, startled. "Daniel?" May nodded. "He didn't say much. Just read, sometimes wrote in a notebook. Always watched the street, though, like he was waiting for something. Or someone." Ellen's throat tightened, and she reached for the cup, more for comfort than caffeine. "I didn't know," she said finally, her voice quieter than she meant it to be. "Most people don't," May replied gently. "But silence has its own kind of language, doesn't it?" The cappuccino was perfect. Even the foam shaped like a heart, just like Daniel used to do. Ellen sipped slowly, letting the warmth spread through her fingers and then her chest. She didn't cry, but something in her blinked slower, as if adjusting to the idea that the past hadn't walked away. From her, it had been waiting, sitting in this very spot, with 2 sugars. Every Thursday. The walk home felt different. Not just because the street seemed somehow quieter, or because the air had taken on that specific crispness unique to early October, but because Ellen could no longer pretend she didn't know. There was a quiet weight in the knowing that Daniel had stayed, that he had waited, in the only way someone who respects silence more than pride could wait. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through her kitchen window as she entered the house, placing the half-drunk coffee beside the sink, untouched since May's words. She wandered through the rooms without purpose, as if her body moved slightly ahead of her thoughts. Everything looked the same, yet something had changed. Not in the space, but in the way she was now seeing it. She paused by the hallway cabinet. It had always stuck slightly when opened, and she had long stopped noticing the way it resisted, like an old memory reluctant to be touched. Her fingers curled around the brass handle, and with a firm pull, it gave in. Inside, ordinary things. Loose batteries, an old scarf, a ticket stub from a play she barely remembered attending. And then, near the back, a drawer. She had forgotten the drawer. Not locked, just stuck from years of disuse. The kind of drawer you keep meaning to clean out, but never quite do. She wiggled it free, and a small stack of photographs slid forward, followed by a roll of undeveloped film. Ellen stilled. She hadn't used film in nearly a decade, not since Daniel gifted her that vintage camera one Christmas, insisting that real memories belonged on paper, not just in pixels. She sat at the dining table, her fingers brushing across the photographs, her laughing with her eyes closed, him with a piece of toast between his teeth, the pair of them mid-dance. In the kitchen, barefoot. All moments she thought were gone, blurred in time's soft erasure. But here they were, sharp and kind, in black and white. And then, the film. She turned it in her hand slowly, then stood, walked to the hallway, and opened another drawer, this one holding the camera itself. Still dusty, still heavy with a familiar promise. The roll inside had expired, the battery long dead, but the story, whatever it captured, was still locked within. That evening, she walked to the photo shop 2 streets over. The owner was still there, gray-haired now, but sharp-eyed. He remembered her instantly. "I didn't think people still used these," she said with a nervous laugh, placing the roll on the counter. "Only the ones who remember," he replied, taking it from her hands like it was a precious object. As she stepped out into the dusk, she realized she hadn't just found a roll of film, she had found evidence. Not of what they lost, but of what they had once held. Tangible. Imperfect. Real. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to see it clearly now, not with longing, but with open eyes. 2 days passed, just long enough for doubt to begin whispering. Again, like wind under a door you thought was sealed. Ellen almost didn't go back for the photos. She told herself it wasn't urgent, that it could wait, but deep down she knew. She wasn't afraid of what might not be there. She was afraid of what was. The shop bell rang softly as she stepped inside. The owner smiled before she even spoke, as if he had been expecting her. "They turned out," he said simply, and handed her a neat envelope, the weight of it suddenly heavier than it should have been. She didn't open them there. She walked home in silence, the envelope pressed to her chest beneath her coat, feeling more like a keepsake than a packet of photographs. The moment she closed the door behind her, she sat on the floor, legs crossed like a child, and pulled them free. The first few were what she expected, warm, ordinary snapshots of a weekend trip they had taken upstate. A picnic blanket, wildflowers. Her tangled hair under a knit hat he always said made her look like a lighthouse keeper's wife. Daniel, squinting at the sun, pouring coffee from a thermos, mid-laugh. They looked happy. Not perfect, but deeply, presently happy. The kind of happiness she had once convinced herself could never last, because it felt too good to trust. She turned the next one over and stopped. There it was. A photograph she didn't remember being taken. She was facing away from the camera, looking down at something just out of frame. And Daniel, he was looking at her. Not smiling, not posing, just watching. His eyes full of something too tender to be staged. As if, in that one stolen second, he knew everything he wanted was standing a few feet away, unaware. Her hand trembled as she placed the photo aside. The next one nearly undid her. It was a kiss. Blurred, out of focus. Clearly taken by accident, or maybe with intention, but no. Steadiness. Their faces close, slightly turned, lips just meeting, her eyes half closed. There was movement in it, like the camera had caught something alive and too fleeting to hold. A kiss that hadn't meant to be recorded, and yet, there it was. Proof that at least once, they had been that unguarded. Ellen stared at it for a long time, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. Not anymore. There was sweetness in the blur, mercy even. The past had softened its edges, and what remained wasn't the sting of departure. It was the echo of what was real. She hadn't made it up. She hadn't romanticized something hollow. It had mattered. He had looked at her like that. They had loved each other, even if neither of them had known how to carry it all the way through. She leaned back against the wall, eyes closed, and for the first time in years, let herself say his name aloud. Not in grief or in longing, but in gentle acknowledgement, Daniel. It wasn't a decision so much as an impulse, gentle but insistent, like the way birds know when it's time to return home. The morning was pale with mist, the kind that clung to windows and softened the edges of everything it touched. Ellen stood at her front door for a long time, holding the photograph of the kiss in one hand and her breath in the other. She wasn't sure what she hoped for, only that she couldn't stay still any longer. Daniel's house was only 4 blocks away. She had never walked them with intention before, never counted them, never measured the quiet between one street lamp and the next, never realized how little distance had always existed between them in miles, and how much in courage. Each step felt heavier and lighter at once. She noticed things now, how the trees along Sycamore Street had turned a deep amber, how the corner florist had a new display of dried lavender, how every small, ordinary thing felt suddenly alive, like it was bearing witness, like the world itself had waited patiently for her to come to this moment. When she reached his house, she paused at the gate, her fingers curled tight around the photograph. The porch light was off, the windows half draped. A mailbox she'd never noticed had his name still printed in careful serif font, D. Callan. She smiled at how unchanged it was. How Daniel had always been the kind of man who didn't replace something just because it aged. She knocked once, then again, softer. No answer. A full minute passed. She almost turned away, heart pulsing against her ribs, whispering that perhaps this was enough, that coming here, standing here, was her own kind of closure. But just as she stepped back, the door opened. He stood there barefoot, in a sweater too soft to be new. His eyes registered surprise, then something quieter, something like peace. "I didn't expect you," he said gently. "I didn't expect to come," she replied. They stood like that for a while. The moment didn't demand filling, it allowed space. Finally, she held out the photo. "I thought maybe you should see this," she said. He took it, looked down, and when he looked back at her, his eyes were full. "I remember that kiss," he said. She nodded. "I didn't until now." He looked at her for a long time, then stepped aside. Not an invitation, not pressure. Just space being made. Room, if she wanted it. She didn't step in, not yet. But she smiled. A small, steady smile. The kind that only comes when you realize you've been holding your breath for years without knowing, and in that stillness something unspoken passed between them. Not resolution, but return. Not to what was, but to what might still be. Not to what was, but to what might still be. They didn't speak much that evening. Ellen didn't step inside, but she lingered, just past the doorway, just enough to catch the scent of chamomile and old pages drifting out from somewhere deeper in the house. Daniel didn't ask why she'd come, and she didn't offer. Some moments weren't built for explanations. They were built for presence. But as she turned to leave, his voice, quiet and low, caught in the space between them. "Do you remember the old wooden box I used to keep my letters in?" Ellen paused, nodding slowly. "The one with the map carved on top." Daniel stepped back, disappearing briefly, then returned with the very box in hand. It looked smaller now, or maybe her hands had just changed. He held it for a moment, then offered it to her. "I never threw them out," he said. "I just stopped rereading them." She didn't open it until she got home. She sat in the armchair by the fireplace, the same one where she used to curl up after long days, reading, while the wind hummed low beyond the glass. The box was warm from being held. Her fingers hovered for a beat too long before lifting the lid. Inside, dozens of envelopes, all addressed to her, none ever stamped. Each letter had a date and a season, and some kind of quiet ache folded between the lines. You left this morning without your gloves. I watched your hands shiver through the cafe window, and I hated myself for not running after you. It's been 7 Thursdays. I still sit by the window table in case. I saw a woman today who laughed like you. It undid me. Ellen read until her eyes burned. These weren't just letters. They were fragments of a man unraveling. Then, trying to gather himself again, all while leaving a space open in case she ever came back. And then came the one she hadn't expected. Undated, untitled, but folded differently, creased, frayed. As if it had been read more than all the others. It began, "There's something I never told you, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to without asking you to carry a part of my grief." Her breath caught. "You always thought I loved you in spite of your silence, but the truth is, I loved you because of it, because I recognized it. It was the same silence I grew up with. The same one that filled our house after my mother left. You didn't talk about what hurt. Neither did I. And maybe that's why we never learned to bleed together, only separately." Ellen clutched the page. There, tucked in a paragraph, was a truth she'd never imagined, that Daniel's gentleness hadn't been passivity. It had been protection, not of himself, but of her. She leaned back slowly, letter pressed to her chest, and for the first time in all those years, she let her mind walk through what it meant, not to be abandoned, but to have been loved in silence, by someone who never learned to say stay, because he thought she needed to go. It was raining when she returned the next day. Not the kind of storm that demands shelter, but a steady, honest drizzle that softened the world and blurred the edges of rooftops, leaves, and memories. Ellen walked without an umbrella, letting the cold droplets soak through the sleeves of her coat and cling to her cheeks like something earned. She held the box of letters in her arms like a bundle of something living. Daniel opened the door before she knocked, as if he'd been watching through the curtain, or perhaps through the same kind of quiet intuition they'd always shared, the kind that didn't need sound to recognize longing. "I read them," she said without stepping in. He nodded once, slowly. "I wondered if you would." She held up the last letter, the one without a date, without a name, the one that had folded her in half the night before. "You should have told me." He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed not in defiance, but as though holding himself together. "I didn't think it would help. We were already falling apart and I—" Ellen stepped forward, voice softer now. "You thought I'd leave anyway." Daniel's silence wasn't a denial. She searched his face, the same lines she used to trace with her fingers on Sunday mornings, the tired kindness in his eyes. "You weren't wrong," she said, her voice breaking around the edges. "But not for the reasons you thought." He motioned her in then, not with urgency, but with a kind of gentleness she remembered. The house smelled like bergamot and cedarwood, like memory and warmth. Books still lived in haphazard piles along the hallway, and a half-finished mug of tea sat on the windowsill. They sat across from each other in the kitchen, both hands wrapped around their own silences, until Ellen finally said the thing she hadn't even known she'd come to say. "I left because I thought you deserved someone simpler, someone who didn't second-guess love every time it knocked." Daniel looked at her, really looked, the way he always had when he wanted her to know he was listening more with his soul than his ears. "I never needed simpler," he said after a pause. "I just needed you to believe that you were enough, even when you weren't perfect." She stared at her hands, trembling slightly. "No one ever told me that." "I tried to," he said, almost apologetically. But maybe I was saying it in ways you didn't recognize. In coffee left on your nightstand. In letting you choose the music, even when I hated Leonard Cohen. She laughed softly at that, wiping a tear with the back of her hand. I knew you hated Leonard Cohen, he smiled. Then maybe you knew I loved you more than I ever said. The pause between them stretched. Not awkward, not painful. Just full. And then, for the first time, she asked the question that had lived inside her for nearly a decade. Why didn't you stop me? Daniel didn't flinch. Because you looked like you needed to leave more than you needed to be held. She swallowed hard, and something inside her cracked. Not broken, but opened. They sat there, beneath the quiet ticking of the kitchen clock, and let the truth fill in the space that had long been carved by assumptions, pride, and too many words, left unspoken. Ellen reached across the table, slowly, her fingers grazing the back of his hand. I'm still learning how to stay, she whispered. Daniel turned his hand upward, catching hers in his palm. Then we'll learn together. They didn't talk much after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because sometimes the quiet is the most honest conversation of all. Ellen stayed for tea. She sat in the armchair across from Daniel's, cupping the warmth in her hands, letting the weight of everything unsaid finally lift, not disappear, but soften. Like snow beginning to melt into the earth it always belonged to. Outside, the rain had eased into mist. Inside, the clock ticked with the patience of old houses that have seen too many goodbyes and not enough brave returns. Daniel stood after a while, disappeared into the hallway, and returned holding something wrapped in a faded linen handkerchief. He handed it to her with a hesitation that felt reverent. I kept this, he said. I don't know why I never told you. Ellen unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing a small silver pendant. Oval, simple, worn smooth on one side. Her breath caught. It was hers. She had lost it during a weekend at his sister's lake house. Thought she'd dropped it in the garden or left it in a drawer. She remembered searching everywhere, eventually giving up with a shrug that masked disappointment. She had told herself it wasn't important, but it had been. It had belonged to her mother, passed down quietly like a blessing stitched into metal. I found it in my car the day after you left, Daniel said softly. It was on the passenger seat, tucked into the seam. I meant to return it. I even wrote a note. But he didn't finish. He didn't have to. She turned the pendant over in her palm and her eyes blurred, not from sorrow, but from something deeper, the ache of being remembered gently. You kept it all this time? Daniel nodded. It sat in my desk drawer. I took it with me whenever I moved, even when I thought I was ready to forget you. Her voice was no louder than a breath. But you never did. No, he said. I tried. But some memories carry you, even when you think you're the one carrying them. She held the pendant tightly, its weight so familiar it made her chest ache. And in that small silver circle, she saw everything she hadn't allowed herself to believe. That she had been loved not just in the big gestures or the words she longed for, but in the quiet collecting of her forgotten things. In the space he saved in his life without needing her permission. In the choice to remember her, not with bitterness, but with care. She looked up, and for the first time saw not the man she had left, but the man who had stayed. Why didn't you send it back? She asked, barely above a whisper. His smile was soft, tired in the most tender way. Because I kept hoping you'd come looking for it. She set her tea down, crossed the space between them, placed the pendant in his hand, then closed his fingers around it. I just did, she said, and in that single moment, unadorned, undecorated, they both understood. Some love stories aren't about going back. They're about returning, with eyes finally ready to see what was always there. The house was quiet long after Daniel had gone to sleep. Ellen stood in the guest room, though it didn't feel like a guest room. The linens were soft, freshly washed. There was a book on the nightstand, The Remains of the Day, one she had once given him with her name scribbled in pencil on the inside cover. He had kept it. She ran her fingers across the spine, then sat on the edge of the bed, hearing only the soft tick of the wall clock and the rain tapping lightly against the glass. It was the first time in years she let herself feel the full weight of having left him. She had always told herself it was circumstantial. That timing was wrong, that she needed to grow, to breathe, to become someone braver before she could truly give herself to anyone. But the truth, laid bare in the stillness, was simpler. She had left him on a Tuesday afternoon with no goodbye. Not because he wasn't enough, but because he was too much, too present, too real, too ready. And she had never been taught what to do with that kind of love. She closed her eyes, letting the room settle around her like a blanket too familiar to resist. Her mind wandered, not to the big moments but the small ones. The way he always poured her tea first, how he never interrupted her when she spoke, even when she rambled about things that didn't matter. The way he reached for her hand under the table without looking. She had thought those things were just kindness. But now she saw them as anchors, small, steady acts of someone choosing to stay. And she, foolishly, had mistaken calm for absence. Had misread steadiness as silence, because she had come from a world where love meant noise, chaos, pleading. Daniel had loved her quietly, and she had missed it entirely. She walked to the window, pressing her fingertips to the cool glass. The garden outside was slick with moonlight, and there, half covered by ivy and years of growth, was the bench they had once built together. It was still there, crooked, weather-worn, but intact. She felt a tear slip down her cheek, not sharp, not desperate, just honest. And suddenly, she remembered something, a morning long ago, when she had woken first and watched him sleep with one arm flung across his chest, mouth slightly parted. She had leaned over then, kissed his shoulder softly, and whispered, "Please don't love me too much. I'll ruin it." She hadn't meant for him to hear, but now she wondered, what if he had? She turned from the window, walked back to the bed, and lay down slowly, her hand still clutching the pendant he had kept. It pressed against her palm like a heartbeat. She had spent years running from the idea that she was capable of breaking something good. And now, here she was, back in the center of it, realizing she already had. The house was almost entirely dark, save for the sliver of amber light spilling from beneath Daniel's study door. Ellen lay in bed, eyes open, her breathing shallow, rhythm broken not by fear, but by the slow settling of a truth long denied. It wasn't the leaving that hurt most now. It was the way she had silenced herself so thoroughly during those years that followed. How she had convinced herself she had done the right thing. That losing something early was better than risking its collapse later. That quieting the part of her that still missed him was strength. She had called it self-preservation. Now, it just felt like exile. She rose, barefoot, stepping into the hallway like she used to in their old apartment. One hand brushing the DE wall, the other cradling her breath. The door to Daniel's study creaked slightly as she pushed it open. He wasn't inside, but the light had been left on, like a small invitation, or maybe a habit. The room smelled faintly of cedar, paper, and the lemon oil he always used to wipe down his desk. It was exactly how she remembered, organized in that oddly endearing way he'd always arranged things. Fountain pens lined like small soldiers, stacks of paper with rocks as weights, framed postcards from places he never visited but always planned to. Then she saw it. Tucked behind a stack of books, leaning casually against the base of a lamp, was a photograph. One she had never seen. It was her, standing on a bridge, hair blown wild by the wind, eyes squinted toward the sun. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't even aware she was being watched, but there was something so alive in her posture, something soft, unguarded, utterly. Daniel had taken this photo. That much she knew instantly. She picked it up with trembling hands, tracing the edge like it might tell her what she'd missed. And in that moment, she understood what she had truly lost. Not just him, not just a life they could have had, but the version of herself that only existed in the safety of his gaze. The one who didn't flinch at vulnerability. The one who believed, even for a brief time, that maybe love could be quiet and lasting and soft all at once. She sat down in his chair, the photograph still in her lap, and closed her eyes. There were no grand regrets, no cinematic unraveling. Just the deep, echoing ache of recognition that she had spent years building walls to keep pain out, only to find herself walled in with loneliness. She had not lost Daniel the day she walked away. She had lost herself, the part of her that once stood on a bridge without fear of being seen. That night, she didn't return to the guest room. She curled up in the chair by the desk, the lamp still on, the photograph held gently in both hands. And as sleep took her, not sudden but slow, like a tide folding over sand, she whispered into the quiet, "I didn't ruin it. I just didn't know how to hold it." And the light stayed on in the other room. Morning came quietly, with a hush, that blanketed the house like a final note held too long in a song that had already ended. Ellen woke slowly, the photograph still in her hand, the armchair beneath her stiff but familiar in its comfort. Daniel hadn't disturbed her sleep, hadn't turned off the light. He had simply let her be. She rose, stiff in her shoulders, and wandered the room with a kind of reverence, as if each object might hold a memory she had once overlooked. Her fingers traced the edge of the bookshelf, the smoothness of the old wooden armrest, the faint indent where his elbow always rested, beside the typewriter. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that her body seemed to move before thought could catch up. Then she saw the drawer, not the top one, where he kept pens and spare keys and shopping receipts, but the bottom one, the one that used to stick, that she remembered him fixing late one night while she sat cross-legged on the rug reading aloud from an article neither of them would remember now. She knelt and pulled gently. It opened without resistance. Inside, stacked neatly, were folders labeled in Daniel's handwriting, published, drafts, rejected, personal. She paused at the last one, heart catching in her chest. She lifted it carefully. Inside were scraps of paper, bits of torn notebook edges, paragraphs half crossed out, and beneath them all, an envelope. It had no stamp, no address, just her name. Written in blue ink, slanted, unshaken, Ellen. She turned it over in her hands, recognizing the weight instantly. It wasn't just paper. It was what he never said. What maybe he had once hoped to send and never did. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The letter was dated nearly 5 years ago. "Ellen, I saw you at the bookstore today. You didn't see me. Or maybe you did and just kept walking. Either way, I couldn't blame you. You looked well. You always looked more whole when you were alone. That used to hurt. Now I think it was the reason I loved you in the first place." Pressed her fingers to her lips, already feeling the tears forming behind her eyes. "I'm not writing to ask anything of you, only to say, I never moved on, not in the way people expect. I built a life. I smiled in photographs. I dated people who liked crossword puzzles and jazz, but I never once looked at someone the way I looked at you when you weren't looking back." She paused, unable to breathe for a second. "And if, someday, by some accident or strange generosity of fate, you ever find this, I hope you'll know I forgave you, long before you asked, and I still make your tea without sugar, out of habit. D." Ellen clutched the letter to her chest, and for the first time since returning to Cedar Hollow, she cried not because something was lost, but because something had remained, quietly, faithfully, unclaimed, but never gone. The letter sat on the table beside her, its edges now slightly curled, as though even the paper had exhaled after years of being kept in the dark. Ellen didn't move for a long time. She just sat there, watching the rain slide down the window, in delicate threads, thinking of all the things she had never allowed herself to feel out loud. The version of herself who had walked away from Daniel had believed she was doing him a kindness. That by leaving, she was freeing him from the weight of someone who couldn't stay still long enough to believe in being loved. She had convinced herself silence was mercy, that if she said nothing, maybe it wouldn't hurt as much, for either of them. But now, holding that envelope, knowing he had written those words and then chosen never to send them, she saw the story differently. It hadn't been silence that preserved them. It had been choice. Daniel had chosen her, over and over, quietly, without conditions, even when she wasn't there to receive it. And she had never chosen to answer. Until now. She rose, walked to the small desk near the window and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. Her hands hovered for a moment, unfamiliar with the act of writing something real. Then slowly, she began. Daniel, I found your letter. It undid me, not because I didn't believe you still thought of me, but because I never imagined you remembered so gently. I think I was always afraid that your memory of me would be harder than I deserved, that you'd recall me as someone who broke what didn't need fixing. And maybe I did. Her hand paused, then continued. But I need you to know. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I didn't know how to be loved by someone who didn't need to fix me to keep me. That scared me more than being alone. She set the pen down, took a deep breath, then wrote, You made space for me when I didn't know how to take up any. You made tea the way I never asked for, but always drank. You waited, without asking me to hurry. And that, Daniel, is the kind of love that leaves something permanent behind, even in its absence. She folded the letter slowly, placed it in an envelope. Then, without writing his name, she slipped it into the drawer beside her bed. It wasn't meant to be sent. Not this time. This one was for her, to know she had said it, that she had answered, even if the moment had passed. Because some truths don't need to arrive in time to matter. They just need to arrive. That night, as she climbed into bed, the weight in her chest felt different. Not gone, but gentler. Like it had been seen, named, and allowed to breathe. And as she drifted towards sleep, she imagined Daniel reading the letter, not in real life, but in some quiet, imagined space between heartbeats and what could have beens. She imagined him smiling, not because she came back, but because finally she stayed. Life didn't return to what it was, nor did it transform into something radically new. It settled, slowly, carefully, into something Ellen could only describe as softer, not easier, just quieter in the right places. Like music finally turned to the right volume after years of either silence or too much noise. She stayed in Cedar Hollow. Not because of Daniel, not entirely, but because for the first time in years she no longer felt the need to run. Her mornings became deliberate rituals, a pot of Earl Grey steeping as light crept into the kitchen, a slice of toast made not out of habit, but care. She began going on long walks again, tracing old paths, nodding to neighbors whose names she didn't yet remember but whose presence now felt like belonging. Daniel didn't ask her to move in. She wouldn't have, even if he had. Whatever existed between them now was not a second chance in the conventional sense. It was something slower, less defined, and in that vagueness, oddly sacred. They met for coffee most Thursdays, sometimes at the cafe, sometimes on the porch of his house, where the ivy had started creeping up higher than before. They didn't always talk about the past. Often they talked about books, weather, and once, a long, meandering conversation about soup that lasted almost an hour. What surprised Ellen most was not how easy it was to be near him again, but how natural it felt not to apologize. He never asked for explanations, and she never offered more than what the silence allowed. One Thursday, after finishing their tea in companionable quiet, Daniel walked her to the edge of the garden. The wind had begun to change, cooler, sharper, but still carried a softness that made her pause. He looked at her then, just briefly, and asked, "Are you all right these days?" She considered lying. She considered saying, "I don't know," or, "I'm still figuring it out," but the words that came surprised her in their honesty. "Yes," she said, "but not in the way I used to be, and I think that's better." Later that day, Ellen returned to her house and opened a box she hadn't touched in nearly a decade. Inside were photographs, postcards, and a dozen unfinished letters she had written to no one in particular. At the bottom, pressed between 2 pages of an old journal, was a receipt from the day she had bought a book for Daniel, the same copy of the remains of the day she'd seen on his nightstand. She had written her name in pencil inside the cover, and completely forgotten. He had not. That night, as she sat on the back steps with a blanket wrapped around her and a notebook balanced on her knee, she began to write again. Not fiction, not letters, just thoughts, fragments, lines that didn't need endings. "I didn't return to fall in love again," she wrote. "I returned to remember the girl I once was when I did, and somehow that felt truer than anything she had said aloud." Weeks passed, like pages turned slowly, nothing skipped, nothing rushed. Ellen found herself noticing things she had long ignored, the way light filtered through her curtains at 4:17 p.m., how the grocery clerk always hummed the same tune near closing, the sound of the train in the distance just before midnight. These were small things, unremarkable to most, but to her, they were the quiet markings of a life being lived, not just remembered. Daniel never asked what they were, nor did she. Theirs was a companionship now made of pauses and eye contact, of tea left on doorsteps and letters never sent, finally being replaced by words spoken softly over dinner, by the simple act of still being there. One evening, he handed her a book, old, spine cracked, pages underlined in pencil. Inside the cover, a note. Not dated, not signed, just 5 words. "We were never unfinished, just paused." She closed the book, held it to her chest, and smiled without speaking. On a chilly afternoon in early November, she found herself sitting alone on the bench by Mirror Lake. The water was still. A single leaf drifted across the surface, tracing a line that seemed to go nowhere, but never sank. She wore her coat buttoned high, scarf tucked in tight, and in her lap, the silver pendant Daniel had once kept for her, now worn as a quiet promise she didn't need to explain. A little girl ran past, chasing a red balloon. Somewhere nearby, someone played the harmonica, badly, but with conviction. Ellen closed her eyes and let the sound drift over her like mist, and then, slowly, she opened her notebook again. This time, she wrote only one sentence. "If he had asked me today, I would have stayed." She didn't cry. There was no need. This wasn't sorrow. It was something quieter, more sacred, like remembering the lyrics of a song you loved long ago, but had stopped singing because you didn't know if it was still meant for you. And just as she finished the line, a shadow fell across her page. She looked up. Daniel stood a few steps away, hands in pockets, smile uncertain but real. "I thought I might find you here," he said. She didn't move, didn't answer, just looked at him, really looked. At the man she had once left, the man who had once let her go, and the man who, after everything, still stood there, 4 blocks, 10 years, and 1 folded letter later. The wind stirred, the leaves danced a little, and Ellen shifted slightly. On the bench, without invitation, without pressure, leaving just enough space beside her. He sat. They didn't touch. Didn't speak. But they both looked out at the water, at the drifting leaf, at the future not as something they had to name, but as something they could simply be in. And as the camera of memory pulled back, not to end, but to hold, the last frame lingered. 2 people. 1 bench, a silence no longer hollow, and a story that maybe never ended at all. Maybe you've walked away once, too soon. Or maybe you've been the one left behind, waiting for someone to turn around. If this story stayed with you, quietly, gently, I hope you'll stay with us too. There are more letters still unopened, more names not yet said aloud, more stories of the ones we almost kept. Subscribe if you'd like to walk with us a little further, and share this with someone who once let go and never stopped wondering what if.